The United States government built a secret global network to collect bones from dead infants. The parents were never asked, the hospitals were told to stay quiet, and for years it worked. By the early 1950s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission had a problem it couldn't admit in public. Atmospheric nuclear testing had been releasing strontium-90 into the air, the water, and the food supply for years. Strontium-90 is a radioactive isotope with no natural presence in the human body. It doesn't belong there, but it was getting in anyway, and the AEC knew it. What they needed to understand was exactly how deep the contamination had gone and how fast it was spreading through the population. The answer to that question was buried in bone. Strontium-90 behaves like calcium inside the body. It follows the same pathways, binds to the same tissue, and concentrates inside developing skeletal structure. That made infants the most precise measurement tool available. Their bones were newly formed, rapidly growing, and had absorbed fallout during the most critical window. An infant skeleton wasn't just evidence. To the AEC, it was a dosimeter, a reading, a data point in a global contamination study that the American public was never supposed to know existed. Project Gabriel came first, launched in 1949 to model how strontium-90 dispersed through ecosystems. But Gabriel hit a limit. Theoretical models could only go so far. To measure what the fallout had actually done to human tissue, they needed human tissue. That need produced Project Sunshine, formally initiated in 1953. The name was chosen deliberately. It sounded warm, scientific, benign. The internal documentation told a different story. AEC officials described the infant bone supply as inadequate and outlined strategies to increase collection volume through hospital partnerships across the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and 7 other countries. 11 nations in total. A covert procurement network built on the premise that dead infants were a renewable scientific resource. The collection method was straightforward and surgical in its deception. Hospitals and morgues were approached by AEC representatives and affiliated researchers. Samples were taken during post-mortem examinations. Small segments of bone, sometimes vertebrae, sometimes ribs, were removed, labeled, and shipped to AEC-contracted laboratories for radiochemical analysis. In some documented cases, entire legs were taken. The remains were returned to families for burial. The families never knew anything had been removed. No consent form existed in any version of the program's public summary. The word consent does not appear in the foundational Sunshine documentation. What appears instead is a clinical concern about collection efficiency and the need to expand the donor base internationally before the usable population of fallout-exposed infant deaths became statistically insufficient for longitudinal study. Project Sunshine was never supposed to be about children. The public-facing mission was atmospheric science, fallout dispersal patterns, understanding how strontium-90 moved through the environment after a nuclear detonation. Clean, abstract, scientific. But the internal AEC memoranda, declassified only after decades of pressure, told a different story. Strontium-90 mimics calcium in the body. It binds to bone. And no bone absorbs it faster or retains it more completely than the developing skeleton of a newborn infant. The scientists knew this from the beginning. The program was designed around it. The children were not incidental to Project Sunshine. They were the point. The collection network was constructed quietly, through back channels in hospitals, university pathology departments, and municipal morgues across 11 countries. The United States, Australia, Brazil, Canada, the United Kingdom, and others. Cooperating institutions received guidance from AEC-affiliated researchers on how to extract and preserve samples. The bones most valued were the femur and the rib, dense with marrow, rich with the isotope signatures they needed to read. Families were told nothing. In some documented cases, samples were taken during routine autopsies with no notation made in the official cause of death record. The paperwork trail was kept internal, routed through scientific correspondence rather than hospital administration. It was designed to leave no visible surface. What makes this more than bureaucratic negligence is the language found inside the program's own documents. A 1953 memo authored by Willard Libby, who would later receive the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, described the need to obtain human bones with, and this is a direct quotation, an advertising campaign or such. The phrase is striking because it treats the acquisition of infant remains as a logistics problem with a marketing solution. The concern was not ethics. The concern was supply. They needed more samples, globally, consistently. And the most efficient way to get them was to never ask permission at all, because asking permission created delay, created refusal, created documentation of a program they were not prepared to defend publicly. By the time Project Sunshine concluded its active collection phase, the sample count had reached approximately 1,500 infants, though some researchers who have studied the declassified files believe the actual number was higher, with certain records either destroyed or never formally cataloged. Australia's participation became a focal point decades later when the government there conducted its own inquiry into what had happened to the remains. Families who came forward described being given vague explanations at the time of their child's death, or no explanation at all. In some cases, parents had requested the return of their child's body and received it, not knowing that portions of it had already been removed and shipped. The bones had crossed international borders. They were in American laboratories. The families had no idea. What the AEC did disclose publicly in the summaries and press releases it did release was carefully stripped of operational detail. Project Sunshine was described as a study of environmental radioactivity. The word infant did not appear. The word bone did not appear. The phrase without consent appeared nowhere, because consent had never been part of the framework to begin with. When congressional inquiries finally forced a partial accounting in the 1990s, the official posture was that the science had been necessary, that the Cold War demanded it, and that the methods, while perhaps imperfect by modern standards, reflected the urgency of the era. That framing did a specific kind of work. It asked the public to weigh the grief of 1,500 families against the pressures of geopolitical survival. It asked them to accept that some costs, paid by people who never agreed to pay them, were simply the price of national security. The families were never asked. That was the whole architecture of the program. And the architecture held for nearly 40 years before anyone looked directly at it. Project Sunshine was never about weather. The name was chosen deliberately, a word that conjures warmth and transparency, chosen to obscure something the Atomic Energy Commission knew would be indefensible if it ever reached the public. What they had built, quietly and methodically, across 11 countries, was a pipeline for human tissue, infant human tissue. Strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear detonations, mimics calcium in the body and drives straight into bone. Adults had already absorbed years of dietary calcium. Infants had not. Their bones were chemically open, absorptive, precise instruments for measuring exactly how deeply American nuclear testing had poisoned the global food supply. The AEC knew this in 1953. They never told anyone outside the program. Hospitals in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and beyond became quiet collection points. Families buried empty caskets, or caskets weighted with something other than what they believed. No consent form exists in any declassified file because no consent was ever sought. That was not an oversight. That was policy. The scale of what they suppressed only fully surfaced decades later in 1995, when the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments began cataloging what Cold War science had actually done to the people living inside it. What they found confirmed what the internal AEC memos had always shown. Officials had discussed, in writing, the difficulty of obtaining samples, quote, through legitimate channels, and had decided the solution was to avoid those channels entirely. They had also noted that public knowledge of strontium-90 contamination levels would generate, and this is their language, quote, unreasonable fear. The fear they were protecting was not yours, it was theirs. Fear of liability, fear of the anti-nuclear movement gaining ground, Fear that the true cost of the bomb, measured in the bones of dead children, would outweigh the political value of the tests. They made that calculation. They made it repeatedly, and they buried the results in classification labels for 40 years. What this means is not simply that a program was unethical. Programs get labeled unethical and forgotten. What this means is that the institutional architecture required to do this, the hospital contacts, the morgue access, the international coordination, the deliberate omission from every public summary, that architecture was built, tested, and maintained without a single meaningful point of internal resistance appearing anywhere in the record. No whistleblower stopped it. No administrator refused. The system worked exactly as designed, which tells you something about what the system was designed to do. Tell us in the comments what you think the consent conversation inside those hospitals actually looked like, or whether you believe the full sample count has ever been honestly disclosed. Subscribe and stay with us, because every week we dig up another story they hoped you would never find.